One of the really intriguing things about the Corinthian epistles is that implication that you get in 1 and 2 Corinthians, that actually this community is of enormous importance for Paul, that Paul has this vision of the community as being really significant. And as a result, he's even more anxious than he would have been otherwise about what they think, how they react, what kind of community life they reflect. So, of course, one of the really interesting questions is, why were the Corinthian community so important for Paul? What was it about the Corinthian community that made them such a central group of people in Paul's ministry? And there's all sorts of reasons, so all sorts of answers to this. One of them is simply geography. So if you have a look at the map of the Roman Empire, it's almost impossible to go anywhere in the Roman Empire without going through Corinth. You either, if you're going from Rome to the ancient Near East, or if you're going from northern Greece down to southern Greece, you automatically must pass through Corinth. If you have a look at the map of the way in which the Roman Empire spreads out, this might at first glance sound a somewhat odd thing to say, because you'll notice that Corinth is in the middle, in an isthmus between northern and southern Greece. But then, as now, one of the really striking things about the southern bit of Greece is that the winds blow in such a direction that actually it's very, very dangerous to sail around the bottom bit. So consequently, what they did is they discovered that the safest and best way of progressing was actually to sail up and get as close to Corinth as they could. And then what they did in the ancient world was that they got the boat out of the sea, put it on wheels on something known as the diolkos, which is a small road, and they wheeled the boat down the road, popped it in the sea on the other side, and off they went again. You can get something of a flavour of the danger of sailing around the southern bit of the south bit of Greece from Paul's account of the shipwreck. If you know the story of Paul's shipwreck, they have this boat of prisoners that they're taking off to Rome, and he eventually gets shipwrecked just round the bottom bit of Greece. And I would argue that the reason that happens is because they have a ship load of prisoners, and they don't want to get all the prisoners off the boat at Corinth in order to trundle the boat along the diolkos and put it back on the other side. So they make the more dodgy journey of going round the southern bit of Greece. As a result, they were going at the wrong time of year as well, and therefore they experienced a shipwreck. So that just gives you a little flavour of the significance of Corinth and why it was so important, which was that you had to travel from east to west, from north to south, and in the opposite direction through Corinth. So in a way, Corinth was in a certain way more important than Rome, because Corinth was the place that everyone travelled through on their way from somewhere to somewhere else. And as a result, that gives you something of the flavour of the importance of the Corinthian community, because they are a crossroads. People travel from one place to another through Corinth. And therefore, Corinth was a place that was both influenced by a large number of people and, possibly more important for Paul, could influence a whole load of people. So people who are travelling around the Roman Empire could encounter the Corinthian community and begin to encounter something about the nature of Christ and who he was. If the Corinthian community starts getting it wrong, then actually that makes a huge impact on Paul's mission. And I think that's one of the reasons why Paul gets so worked up about the Corinthian community and why they're very important. So one explanation for why Corinth is very important is geography. Another explanation for why they're so important is history. The other very striking thing about Corinth is that until 146 BC, Corinth was one of the major towns in Greece. It was enormously significant, it was very, very wealthy, it was a very prosperous town, and to a certain extent rivaled Athens in its significance. In 146 BC, the Romans destroyed Corinth because they tried to rebel against the Roman Empire. And for 100 years, it lay pretty much in ruins until 44 BC, when it was rebuilt by Julius Caesar as a symbol of his importance at the time. So one of the very interesting things about Corinth as a city is that you haven't got anyone living in Corinth who has lived there historically for a very, very long time. And one of the things that we can tell from some of the archaeology and sociology of ancient Corinth around the time of Paul is the fact that people who lived in Corinth in that particular period were people who were newly rich in various different ways. They didn't have deep roots. So there were probably not a large number of aristocratic families. There were not people who could trace their roots backwards into old stories about who they were and where they came from. What you would have instead is a collection of people who were trying to reinvent themselves, who were trying to work out what their new identity could be because they were now in this new city. It was a new town. It was a Roman equivalent of a new town, with everything that brings along with it. And as a result, what you get is a whole kind of lot of expression in the Corinthian period of this time of people who are trying to work out who they are, where they're coming from, where they're going to. And again, you can get a flavour, therefore, of why they're really important for Paul, because they are a community ripe for an understanding of what it means to be people who have a new identity in Christ. And as a result, they really ought to have understood what Paul was talking about. And Paul, therefore, gets very aerated, very angry with them when they seem to misunderstand the whole point of what he's talking about self-identity. So there's two reasons why Corinth is a really important city in this particular period. There are many others, but those, I think, are two good starting reasons for why we need to recognise that Corinth may be one of the most of the Pauline, the most important of the Pauline communities, because geographically and historically it offers Paul an opportunity to talk about Christ and identity in Christ in a way that might not have been able to be taken up anywhere else in the Greco-Roman world. One of the big questions about 2 Corinthians is the whole question of how Paul engages with the Corinthian community. One of the strands that you can get, if you try and piece things together from Acts and from 1 and 2 Corinthians, the first thing that comes to sight, which is a really significant thing, is that Paul has an extended relationship with the Corinthian community. We imagine sometimes, I think, that Paul's a bit of a cut and run evangelist. He comes, he proclaims, and off he goes somewhere else. I think what you get through the pages of 1 and 2 Corinthians is an insight into a man who deeply cares about the congregations he founds, deeply cares about the communities. And so he comes back again and again. He sends letters, he visits, and his concern is for the welfare of that community. He's not just coming back to shout at people. He's coming back actually to help them to understand who they are in Christ and to get a stronger sense of the gospel and what is important about it. And you find that, I think, particularly in 1 and 2 Corinthians. One of the very striking features is that you can discover that Paul has written at least 4 letters to the Corinthians. And this is where it gets a little bit confusing. We have a letter referred to in 1 Corinthians, which Paul calls the warning letter. So the implication there is that 1 Corinthians isn't really 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians is really 2 Corinthians, because there was a 1 Corinthians that was written before we've got 1 Corinthians. So you've got the first letter, then you've got the letter we now have and call 1 Corinthians, which is effectively 2 Corinthians. Then you've got a third letter, which Paul refers to in 2 Corinthians as the painful letter, or the letter of tears. So what you've got is that he writes 1 Corinthians, he then writes another letter, which is the painful letter, and then he writes 2 Corinthians. So you've got at least 4 letters of communication between Paul and the Corinthian church. Alongside that is you've got more than one visit of Paul to the Corinthian community. You've got his first visit, which is referred to in Acts 18. The challenge is you don't have the other visits referred to explicitly in Acts. So it makes it all a little bit confusing to work out when he went and how the relationship went. Again, in 2 Corinthians, he refers to a painful visit, which seems to have taken place just before he wrote the painful letter. So that is a really significant moment in Paul's ministry, because that's the time when he has a very, very difficult relationship with the Corinthians. We're not quite sure what went wrong, but something went wrong. So it meant that Paul's visit was very painful. He wrote a letter which was painful both to him and to them. And then, very significantly, he said he was going to go back and see them again, we gather from the opening chapters of 2 Corinthians, and he didn't go. And the big complaint that the Corinthians have against Paul in 2 Corinthians is he said he'd go and visit them and he didn't go and visit them. But actually, you need to understand that complaint in the light of this slightly disastrous relationship that had been growing up between them, that he'd had a painful visit, he'd written a painful letter. He then decided that going would not be a good idea at that point. But of course, they remembered that he said he would go and are holding it against him, so that by the time you get to 2 Corinthians, you've got this horribly enmeshed and really kind of difficult relationship that the Corinthians apparently are losing faith in Paul and who he is as an apostle, because they say he's no longer trustworthy. They think that he said he would do various things which he then didn't do, and therefore they've lost their trust in Paul. And some of what 2 Corinthians is about is Paul saying to the people of God in Corinth, actually, it doesn't really matter whether you trust me. It doesn't really matter whether I, as an apostle, am someone that you have faith in. What you must have faith in is the gospel. And he would like, I think, for the Corinthians still to have faith in him. But the more important thing for Paul is that they have faith in the gospel. So you have this very interesting and quite extended, and it must be said, quite tortuous relationship between Paul and the Corinthian community, in which you have a breakdown of relationship which is found both before the writing of 2 Corinthians and in 2 Corinthians itself. The thing we'd all love to know, but which we don't know, is whether 2 Corinthians solved the problem, and actually they then are in better relationship with Paul or not, or whether they then took no notice of Paul and went off in their own way. I certainly would love to think that the epistle of 2 Corinthians transformed things for the Corinthian community and they understood what Paul was talking about. But who knows? We never will know whether they actually forgave him or not for not going to visit. Question, of course, is what is 2 Corinthians about? What is the major flavour of the epistle of 2 Corinthians? And the first thing to notice is that 2 Corinthians is actually something of a poor cousin for a lot of Paul's epistles. If you look through the kind of centuries of Christian history, there are very, very few historical commentaries on the whole of 2 Corinthians. The only extant one from the very early church is one by John Chrysostom. We have indications that there were others written, but none that are extant. Luther didn't write a commentary on 2 Corinthians from the Reformation period. Calvin did, of course, because Calvin has a kind of whole range of different commentaries. But there's nothing from Luther, nothing from some of the big major thinkers. And one of the reasons for that is that 2 Corinthians appears, at least on first glance, to be quite fragmentary. It doesn't seem to have It's not a hard-hitting epistle like something like Galatians or Romans. It doesn't have an overall apparent theme or scheme. It seems to is a lot more disjointed. But I would say that 2 Corinthians is an overlooked treasure trove. It's what you've got in it are some wonderful pieces of theology. Some of Paul's most profound writing, I would believe, comes from 2 Corinthians.